because it seems like we've got a good group here.
New Zealand.
Amazing. Oh, that's great to hear, everyone. Keep using that chat function. So just by way of introduction for you all, my name's Anna Sellows. You probably have received some emails from me in the lead up to this, and we've got Steve Lacy and Jake on the screen as well. But before they kick off, I wanted to just first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today. I know we're online, but it's great that we're able to connect from basically all states in the country, it seems. And, you know, that we can share our own experiences and learn from each other. Storytelling and community connection is a really big part of Indigenous culture, and it's something that they've been practicing for thousands of years. So we really keep this in mind today as we, you know, as we go through this morning. And in the spirit of reconciliation, leading teams would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So this morning, Steve and Jake are going to run you through how our model and how to create a high performance culture in your team for about 60 to 70 minutes. And in that time, if you've got questions, if you can put them into the Q&A function there, so that is different from the chat. So if you can chuck those questions that you've got into the Q&A, and then at the end of the session, we'll have some time to answer them. And if we don't get to them, we'll be able to follow up with you as well. So as a quick introduction, if you don't know Steve or Jake, I was doing some research and they both joined leading teams approximately 2015, 2016. So there are some similarities there. Jake's based in Ballarat and Lace is based in Adelaide, and they've both come from very different careers and backgrounds to become facilitators at leading teams, but they both really share in that passion to help teams and leaders improve performance. So we're really lucky to have them here to talk us through the model and how to create a high performance culture. So I'll hand it over to you guys.
Thanks, Anna. It's a real delight to have the people scattered from what we can see Australia and New Zealand. There might be others from around the place joining us. So yeah, we normally love being in the room, but we also are very grateful for these sort of technologies to be able to have some conversations about, I know for Jake and I, a topic which we love and have loved for a long time. A couple of things. We were sort of chatting and preparing for this. We know that possibly some of the reasons why people have joined, we know a few that are very familiar with our work, and so it might be a bit of a refresh or a top up. There might be some joining who have heard of leading teams or are interested in this topic, that you're sort of coming in with something you want to get out of it. There might be some of you who are well entrenched in the leading team's work, and this hopefully acts as a way of just reviewing or reflecting what you're doing and where you're at. So Jake and I hope that through these chats, it'll be sort of interactive between us. We'll tell some stories, we'll link it back to our model. And we hope that by, the time we finish, everyone participating has got something that's going to help them in terms of your leadership and helping your culture wherever you are. So shall we dive into the model? I know, just as you may have heard it coming in, Jake's cleared out his 3 kids for this session, so he should have peace and quiet. I've got 2 little rat bags somewhere in the house, so hopefully they don't just if you hear screaming, it's on my end, on the family front, but Ely's going to do a good job at keeping them at bay. So I will kick off with our model, which probably for Jake and I and all of our team at leading teams, so there's nearly 30 of us now scattered around the country, everything that we do comes back to this one slide, which we love. We've tried and tested. I know when I started, as Anna said, in 2015, I asked people prove it wrong, test it. And so far, if people are on board with the philosophy of leadership around empowerment, this model works. So we want to walk you through it. And at the very top, it starts with high-performing teams need high-performing leaders. So for us, you can't have one without the other. Jake, I know often people, when we show this, say, oh, well, isn't this where, the fish rots from the head? You've heard that a few times before?
Yeah, definitely, Lace. I've heard you talk about that story a little bit. I think you've got a family member that might have had something to do with fishmongering or fishing. Is that right?
Father-in-law, mate. Yeah. Yeah, he's cut open a big tuna, and I literally know what it's like, fish rotting from the head all the way through. So it's a common expression, which if the fish head is healthy, the rest of the organisation is healthy, and if it's not, then that can ripple down. So for us, it starts at the top. I remember reading that one of the former American presidents, Harry Truman, on his desk in his office had a little plaque that said, "The buck stops here." And so in cultures that are really high performing, the leaders recognise that the buck does stop there. So that's sort of where we start. So we're going to sort of unpack the ingredients that over nearly 30 years of working in a range of organisations, these are the ingredients that we've found help shape high-performing teams and high-performing leaders. So the next one is around purpose. So apologies there. We'll go back. Often we ask, Jake, the question of what's the purpose of a purpose?
The purpose of a purpose, I think, it comes back to, so what the team does under pressure. And there's a beautiful saying that leaders create clarity so others can self-manage. I think there's a real distinct difference between a purpose where it's just a tick the box exercise, or it might be something that we put into corporate speak, versus something that we have a real emotional connection to. So some of the questions that we would use to help a team create a purpose is, why does this team exist? And another one that I know Ray's used for the last 25 odd years is, if this team didn't exist, would anyone be any worse off? And I think that's the other one where you start to think about, if we really didn't exist, what would be the consequences of that? And so I think that probably comes back to it. And if we don't have a proactive response from all members of the team when that question, why are we doing this, then that can affect performance. So I think for me, it's quite a simple way to start to think about creating clarity so others in the team can self-manage. And I know even in preparation for this, we had some conversations. I dug up a couple of old videos, and the one that when the pandemic first hit, and it was very different to what Ray would normally do, jumping online to sort of round the troops up. We're all scattered around Australia, and basically went through our common purpose, which is to help teams, individuals improve performance. But really quickly was very prescriptive around acknowledging that it didn't have a little sort of antidote underneath our purpose, or only if the client can't pay, or only if things become a bit tough, or if a world pandemic hits, can you still not do that? So that really helped. I know it helped a number of us in the team to go back to, what are we actually here to do? So that's the common purpose for me, Lace. But I know you've had some experience in lots of different teams, Steve. So is there a story that resonates for you when you think about common purpose?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. There's a number. I probably just want to reinforce there. Sometimes, the semantics sort of can get a little bit muddled here. So I really want to reinforce what Jake's saying, is that this question of purpose is around the why. It's not about what you do or how you do it. It's about why you actually exist. And so, as I said earlier, we've worked with a number of different organisations, and I love Camilla's listening, from Groote Island. So I love working up there at Groote with the Anandiliakwa Land Council. And she may have heard this story, but I've spent a bit of time working with some bands. And one band, there was a team of 3, and they'd been playing around Australia and overseas for nearly a decade. And we got to this part of the model, and I said, well, why do you guys exist? And they said, oh, well, we haven't really thought about that. I said, well, we could show you the records and we can tell you where we've been and what we've done, but not really the why. So the 3 of them left to have some time to reflect. They came back, and one returned and said, we exist to rock and roll. I said, yeah, fair enough. Valid. Second said, we exist to make a bucket load of money, although that's not exactly what they said, but I'll paraphrase that one. And the third said, we exist to write music that connects with the hearts and minds of our fans. So to your point, Jake, were they aligned? Were they on the same page? Not really at that point, but it created a great conversation for them to then get on the same page and clarify their why. So again, in my experience working with a range of teams, and if you're listening, I'd be asking myself, our organisation might have a really clear purpose, and that's excellent, great. And I hope that you know that, and I hope that the people in your organisations know your organisational why. We're talking about teams here, so this is where your team should really have absolute clarity on their why. Why they exist, and as Jake said earlier, not just to tick a box and we've done that, but once you've clarified that, it's then, if you're serious about being high performing, to ask yourself, well, we need to review our performance consistently and regularly against our purpose. As we make decisions, does it align with our why? As we bring in new people to the team, we want to induct them into our purpose. So it should be very live, your purpose. It should be something that at the end of every day, if you're really clear on your purpose in your team, you should be able to go home at night or whenever you finished your shift or whatever it might look like and say, out of 10 today, how have I gone at living our purpose? And you should be able to do it and measure it every day. So we've seen purpose and the power of why, especially from leaders in the last couple of years. Through COVID, it's been such a powerful tool for teams and leaders to use to sort of anchor what they've been doing. So purpose, as you can tell, it's a bloody important one and really significant. So that's the first ingredient. Next, you saw a little sneak peek. If you haven't seen our model before, but I throw up mechanics and dynamics, and we'd say any team, whether it be a rock band, whether it be a local not-for-profit, whether it be a big corporate or a footy club, you can break teams into 2 parts, even families into 2 parts. So you've got the mechanics and the dynamics. So let's kick off, Jake, with the mechanics, mate. What comes to mind when you hear mechanics?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I've found over the journey, and where teams start to get a bit, they're not sure about how it works, is a strategic plan. And so if I even link that back to common purpose, so someone will say, yeah, we've got one, and they'll say it's on our website, and you go, yeah, okay, that's cool. So what's that? Oh, that's our vision statement. That's our mission statement. And how we measure what we do in the team. So that sort of stuff. But so a vision and mission strategic plan, I think and I'm sure you've had some stories about this, Lace, as well, but I've never seen a strategic plan jump off the page and run itself. So it will have some structure and we'll have it. And I mean, I've done some work in some hospitals, and, some of those are quite large documents. For us, it's really around how you measure things, the technical skill within a team. So one of the things that we talk about leading teams, and it's a catch cry, it's obviously it's any given team. We believe this model works with any given team, but we're not naive enough to go into a team and start to tell them how to do their job. So that the skills that teams possess sort of sits within the mechanics. So there's strategic plan, technical skill, things like policies and procedures, systems. You could just keep going down that path. So hopefully that paints a bit more of a picture around when we're sort of breaking the team up into 2 parts. that's the mechanics part.
It's good. And very important, as you say, Jake. And so the dynamics is essentially the people side. So if, as Jake said, the mechanics, if you think process, systems, KPIs, technical skills, dynamics is the people, it's the behaviours, it's the relationships, it's all the things that sort of connect to people and how they interact. And I know, again, as you're listening, you're probably perhaps wondering, okay, yeah, I reckon I spend more time in the mechanics, or I reckon I spend more time in the dynamics, or you might ask yourself, what do we recruit against? Are we recruiting people in our organisation, or was I recruited based on my technical skills, or more about being the right cultural fit? These questions, again, we find leaders who really understand this model of empowerment are very clear on this. For me, probably around the recruitment piece, looking at these two elements of mechanics, dynamics, I've done a bit of work prior to the pandemic with Virgin, and the leader there had this interesting and somewhat tricky situation. He had a woman who was in Queensland who technically was regarded as probably one of the greatest in her field in the country. And he rang me and he said, Lace, I've got this situation where, we're trying to bring someone down from Queensland to Sydney to join our team. We've got her down to the last sort of handful. Technically, she's outstanding, but culturally, what we've created and what we're creating here in Sydney, we don't think she's going to be the right fit. And so I said, well, I think you may have answered your own question through this chat on the phone. And yeah, in the end, they said, look, we're not going to bring you down to Sydney, and you're not going to be the right fit. So again, it's just, I'm sure as you listen, you might have many examples of people who you've seen where it's worked, where people have been recruited based on their character and the cultural fit, and they've been trained up, and it's been a great result for the organisation.
You mentioned cultural fit there, Lace. If you had to describe culture, like for the listeners, so for everyone to just have a walk away and just how would you describe culture?
Well, I often talk about a few things. One, culture, some people who have watched The Castle might think about it's all about the vibe. So I reckon that's not a bad starting point. People almost could, if you walk into different places, you pick up the feel, the vibe, the atmosphere, the spirit of a place. I think if you wanted to sharpen up a little more, you could say, culture is what happens when the boss walks out of the room. Another way that you could think about culture is it's the behaviour we're prepared to walk past, accept and tolerate, which I think that one tests leaders and teams a lot more. So if there's behaviour that is unproductive, if you're like, look, I know that's not right, but you'll tolerate it, you allow it, we would say not only are you accepting it, but you're also rewarding it because you're not doing anything about it. Again, we could spend easily, I'm sure, an hour talking about culture and different cultures, Jake's, we've worked in. Sometimes I find it fascinating walking in and not saying much at the start, just watching the vibe, watching the interactions, and I think that gives us a bit of an indicator of, the culture. Anything you'd add to that, Jake?
I think it also, the harsh reality when we start to think about when you said cultural fit. So I've had that question asked a lot, and how we sort of start to pull that apart and test it. But as someone coming into an organisation, and so, that real setting what the culture is, and is that congruent with what we want, I need to know as a team member how I behave my way in to the culture or how I behave my way out. So for me, it's quite clear is, in any team or any organisation, the clarity around how do I become a really valued team member in this organisation or in this team, as opposed to how can I start to upset the apple cart and, as you said, cultural fit. So that starts in recruitment, goes to induction, performance, and ultimately exit. So but being quite clear about that.
It's true. It's and I'm sure again people are going, yeah, well, probably maybe before the pandemic, culture. We're all sort of work in the office, and now though, cultures are getting tested because of the remote setups, the flexible working arrangements. So again, that's a whole nother conversation. But again, it still links to culture, the way we do things around here. A couple of things that I'd ask people listening to think about is, you know, if we were to ask you what percentage of time do you spend in the mechanics, you know, and give a number out of 100. Sometimes we hear from a lot of different teams that the number's very high, like in 80 plus 90. Sometimes, you know, I work with some accountants and they said it was probably 99. And we don't have a magic number, but sometimes that straight away people recognize, I reckon I've been spending too much time in the mechanics and I need to swing back into the dynamics. And we'll get to sort of what that looks like in a moment. The second question I'd ask you to sort of just consider but also recognize is that when we're under pressure, and this happens in many organizations, often we jump into the mechanics. And that's okay, that's pretty normal, but that's really why it's important for leaders and for teams to recognize we need to keep looking for ways to fight for our dynamics so that when we are under pressure in those mechanical moments, we're in a lot better shape for it. The third piece around mechanics dynamics breakup is often when we work with teams, I ask, you know, so what's easier to measure? You know, is it easier to measure the mechanics or is it easier to measure the dynamics? And Jake, what's the answer you often hear?
I think there's so many metrics around measuring mechanics that I've seen over the journey that, you know, bottom line, I think the book, The Culture Code, is one that has probably started to shift. If you haven't read that, I'd probably strongly recommend that if you're starting to think about, you know, how do I start to measure dynamics? But yeah, you hear all the time, Lace, don't you, that it's easy to measure mechanics as opposed to, you know, is it really tangible? Is this dynamic stuff really tangible? How do I prove that it's working?
Yeah.
And for me, sometimes it's about, you know, why do people leave the organisation? And if you go back up to to be a high performing team, we've got to have high performing leaders. A lot of people don't leave organisations; they leave leaders. And so that's where we start to make that real distinct link between leaders and the behaviour that we walk past as leaders, or the culture that is our non-negotiable. I think that's the bit as well too. So, and also, Lace, I just loved how you mentioned, you know, around measurement. So I think that's important as well. But there's sometimes you go back to the castle, and I was just remembering last time I watched that. But you know, vibe is such an important thing, and when you can feel it, it's quite exhilarating. But it's I can't tell someone that they're empowered. So as a leader, I can't say, "Hey, you're empowered," but we can feel that. So that's created by a leader. It's not said to someone; it's the feeling created by a leader. So I think that's the important distinction as well.
That's good, Jake. Thank you. And probably to sort of flesh that out, so you might be wondering as you listen, well, okay, so you've covered two parts of a team and both are critical. So we don't want to sort of pit one against the other here. You know, they both actually work together. We want to share with you, in terms of the dynamics, well, how do you create a culture that's high performing? And so this is sort of the three ingredients that over a number of decades within leading teams and other places around the world have recognised this and have been doing this as well for centuries. But for us, it's these sort of three anchors really, and this is where we spend our time with teams, you know, investing in. One, it's the strength of the professional relationships. And it's interesting here, we're really deliberate in our language here at Leading Teams, and professional relationships is what we're talking about. I know I've worked in some places where they work, but they're also very good friends outside of work, which is okay. But when we work with teams, and if we're really serious about being high performing, we want there to be a professional level of trust and respect. So that's not kumbaya fluffy stuff, but how do you genuinely build those relationships? And I know in recent times I've been having a lot of people ask, well, how do you build strong relationships when you're working remotely, when you're doing a lot of your day online? And that could be a question, Anna, that pops up in the Q&A, which we can happy to flesh out. So for us, that's the first ingredient. The second, in terms of the dynamics, is around having an agreed behaviour framework. Jake, what we often ask teams, the key word there is what?
So that when you think about, again, it's probably the link between the two, but is getting some agreement. So when we start to build capacity around our relationships, we can agree to disagree, but we're not disagreeable. But when we're talking about agreeing on the non-negotiables in the team, we need to start to understand what is it that we're going to tolerate, or what is it that we're going to reward. So that key part around agreement is pivotal. So it's not just a couple of leaders getting together and putting together a sort of a trademark, or what we might call a value set, or that sort of thing. It's really around pulling it apart, getting all members of the team, and in some cases across the organisation, to have that level of buy-in, to say, is this what I will fight for? So I think the other one, just to go back to the why we, the prescription around professional relationships. So I've been lucky enough to work with Pet Stock. It's now called the Petspiration Group for the last sort of a little bit over 5 years. And my brother-in-law, so Kylie's my wife, but so Kylie's one of 6. She's got 4 sisters and 1 brother. And John's one of the general managers there. And when I first started, we literally had a conversation about, what my role was. And so we have a personal relationship. Our kids, the cousins, they play, they go out to houses, we have barbecues, all those sort of things. But when we're in that environment, we've been able to role model the strength in a professional relationship so others can see that. And that's from a facilitator and a client point of view. So I guess that's the sort of key relationship between having strength and capacity in your relationships that allows you to have what we'll talk about in a moment, conversations around behaviour or performance.
Yeah, it's good. This piece, as Jake mentioned earlier, is around, the agreed behaviours is very much around the empowerment piece. And so if our model around high performance was a dictatorship, then we probably wouldn't have an agreed behaviour framework, because the leader at the top would just be telling you how to behave. But our model of empowerment is around getting the team and the organisation to actually align to what the agreed behaviours are. So we often refer to it as, the team creates their trademark and then their behaviours. Some organisations, some teams refer to as their values, either or, but there's real clarity around the how. So the purpose is the why, and the behaviours is the how. If I think of two examples for me, one recently, I'm working with a manufacturing family business here in South Australia, and they've got 270 staff, and starting with the leadership team, they started creating the draft of their agreed behaviours, but they said, we want to get buy-in from our 270 staff. It's like great sort of conversation and great problem to have. So all the leaders went out to their respective teams and ran through like a mini little workshop that we helped create to get all of the staff to have input into the creation of the behaviours. They then landed on 7 agreed behaviours, which got some really good traction. After about 6 to 12 months, they were like, we reckon we can do more. And so they said, how about we put a challenge out to all of the staff to draw a little image that best represents each of the 7 behaviours. And within their organisation, they've got a couple of gentlemen who are visually impaired. And so they said, look, we want to use some Auslan images to sort of connect to our behaviours. And so now they've got not only the words, but also these images that reflect their agreed behaviours. And there's been a real sort of energy, I see from the organisation around that. And I know Camilla from Groot is online listening, and I loved what the guys did there, which was to align sort of in English with Anandiliacal language, so they're agreed, but they're their values. So there's in English, you know, for example, truth and honesty, and then in language is the value that they've got. So again, these two examples aren't us telling the team, it's the team sort of owning it and sort of really buying into it. How do we bring this to life, whether it be through visuals, images, whether it be through cross-cultural language and making it really inclusive. So they're two that I just love, and I love sharing that because I think it's very powerful. So for us, if we go back to the dynamics, there's the strong professional relationships, there's the agreed behaviours. We'd say when teams are investing time and energy into these two areas, what it's going to help allow you to do is to have genuine conversations. And so, Jake, I know this one we spend a fair bit of time on. For me, if you like maths, in a way, I like looking at this as, you know, strong professional relationships plus, you know, agreed behaviours plus your common purpose enable you to have these genuine conversations. It's not, if you're a leader, you can jump straight down to genuine conversations without the relationship, because that, you know, relationship plus some rigor or some honesty might create resentment. But for us, if you can create sort of the rigor and the relationship, it equals results. So Jake, genuine conversations. Let's just spend a bit of time on this one. What do you talk about when this is raised with the teams that you work with?
I'd probably go back to the origins of, you know, even at leading teams, why we fight and empower teams to have genuine conversations. So the word genuine in itself, you know, it's not hard. There's lots of books, and I guess, you know, you would have heard a lot of these, Lace, as well, but how to have the hard conversation, how to have the performance conversation, how to be brutally honest, you know, how to provide constructive criticism, which in essence is feedback. So it's that ability to build that strength in your professional relationship so that they are strong enough to withstand what we would call a genuine conversation around behaviour or performance. So it's simply the model. And if I'm at one stage, if any of you are sitting there listening going, I know I've got to have a conversation with one of my teammates, but there's something stopping me, explore what it is. And if you start with how strong is your professional relationship, that would generally start to think about, you know, the strategy on why you potentially might have put it off. Because our brains are extremely smart. We're very good at talking ourselves out of some of these conversations that we know that we need to have. And I remember, I guess when Anna, you mentioned, you know, when I first joined leading teams, I remember following Craig around for 6 months, and my sort of induction, or my sort of informal induction, there was a session where I know Grimes, you've met. There was a bit of push and shove, and there was a team, and they were really struggling with this notion of having a genuine conversation. So the open levels of dialogue in a team, giving each other feedback. How does the person respond? And he just said, as long as your motive is pure and you believe at the time what you're saying is true, then all feedback is useful. Can you discuss that for me? So how do you test someone's motive? We've got to have an agreed behavioural framework. We've got to know that, you know, there's a framework that this person is coming to have a conversation with me because it's affecting our performance. And sometimes, and I know, Lace, when you would probably have conversations with teams, a lot of it is around the counterproductive. I often find, I'm not sure if you've got a story where you could talk about, you know, a culture where you walked in and they were so good at being able to challenge each other, they'd forgotten about the reward piece. And so I think that's the other part of it as well. It's a genuine conversation is really, there's thousands of ways to have them, but ultimately, if you broke it down to the simplicity of it, it's the ability to give, receive, and action feedback.
It's good, Joe. Yeah, I do have a few stories. You know, the first one that comes to mind is probably the prison system that I work in. So they're very good at challenging each other, and it's visibly, you can see how uncomfortable in the room it is with some of the teams around giving praise and reward feedback, because it's a muscle they haven't exercised that often because of the culture that many in the teams that I've worked with have been a part of. So it's a really good point. For us, genuine conversations is around that honest, conversation. It should be two-way. It should be done in the spirit of care and wanting to help. It as Jake said, yes, it might be around challenging someone's behavior because against the team's agreed behaviors, or it could be rewarding someone's behavior against the team's agreed behaviors. Often people say, gee, this is the part that I find the hardest, and we say, look, we're under no illusions as humans, this can be a trickier part, but to make it easy, not necessarily to make it easier, if you've got the strength of relationships and the clear behaviours, it makes it easier to have genuine conversations. And I know a couple of the AFL clubs that we work with, some feedback that the players have been sharing in recent times, somewhat publicly, is that the spirit of feedback that they've created in the culture, and we've worked with one club for nearly 20 years and one for 5+, is that if I was to receive feedback, it's coming from a place of care. That's the posture in which they receive feedback. But they have acknowledged that when they started this process, that wasn't necessarily how feedback was received. It was, hold on, aren't you being critical, or what is your motive, or what is your intent? But now they've created enough weight of numbers, the way they do things around here, the culture, the environment it's coming from a place of care. That's why they have these conversations.
And I think for all our listeners, Lace, it's a really good question to start to think about. What's the best bit of feedback that you've received? In the last three months. So, are you open to feedback? Do you seek it? Is it given in your team? How do the recipients respond? How do you respond? Who models that behaviour? And that probably it almost ties in how this model works. So if you go back to be a high-performing team, we've got to have high-performing leaders who reward, model and challenge. The model piece, I guess, is such a pivotal part. So if I'm expecting, someone to do something that I'm not willing to do myself, I ultimately become a hypocrite. So that's that high-performing leader part where, we've got to be clear about what it is we're modelling, so which comes in the agreed behavioural framework. But then how I reward others or challenge others, that's I guess how it ties that part into it as well. So, but Lace, so there's a couple of things that I guess you've used over the journey. But if you've got someone that comes to you and says, "Oh, Steve, look, I just don't know how to have this conversation," where would you start?
Well, I probably want to ask a few more questions. That's probably my style. But then I probably would say sometimes I think we can overthink these things. I'd say, look, you've grown up being probably a teenager. I reckon probably in your friendship groups, you've probably had some pretty honest conversations, or over your journey of your life, even in your family context, you've probably had some pretty honest conversations with people or with a sibling. So it's just trying to translate and sometimes draw from past experience and go, well, what enabled you to be able to have those chats? And sometimes it's just almost saying, well, you've actually got some evidence of being able to do this. You've just perhaps, your own self-talk, or you've got a bit of a block. I loved your question earlier, Jake. I reckon, I'd be asking, so for these conversations, is there someone in particular that you're avoiding or you need to have this chat with? What's the strength of your relationship like? If 1 to 10, if 10 is it's really strong and healthy and there's an abundance of trust, and 0 is it's broken and dysfunctional, what number would you give your relationship? And that, I think, could be a starting point. Sometimes I ask, when was the last time you praised them or rewarded them or thanked them? And they might go, well, I haven't. Okay, well, is there something that they're doing or that they have done that you could reward them for. Again, some of you might be listening and going, gee, Jake, Steve, this is pretty basic stuff. It's a bit of common sense. And I'm like, it is. Like, it is common sense, but in my experience, it's not that common.
No, and the other one I sometimes come across is really simple, and I go, well, simple isn't easy. So it might be simple, but the application, so I guess it's the doing part of it. So which I would sometimes tell a story about my dad. So dad was an electrician, and it's still we catch up every now and then. They're in a caravan somewhere up in Swan Hill, I think, at the moment, but still struggles to understand what we do at leading teams. And I sort of sometimes will just say, well, if you don't test things, what happens? So in Dad's world, if you don't test something, people can get seriously injured or die. And so I guess what we're doing here is really testing. You've got to be able to test your strength in professional relationships. And it's okay to be able to say, well, I thought our relationship was really strong, but then actually under pressure, we've got some work to do. Mm-hmm. And that's all part of the evolution of that continuous improvement. So I've seen it, I'm sure you would have seen it too, Lace, but where relationships are either going two ways. They're either improving or they're going backwards. So it's that continual investment in the dynamic. So whenever, we're not apologetic of it, but when we ask a team to, meet once a month over a 12-month, if not longer period, we're getting them to pause and invest in the dynamics in their team and around those three key pillars of the model. So, but testing how they're going with each part of that is the work.
And it's good, Jake. And as we said earlier, that under pressure, people and teams and leaders often go into the mechanics. And so in recent times, I would say there's been a lot of teams that have been almost like, oh, gee, this session, could we push it back another week or two? It's like, well, are you serious about fighting for the dynamics or not? Because it's going to send a message if you're a leader and you just keep bumping these sessions that you're not making it a priority. And I would almost hand on heart every time say that when the leaders have said, oh my goodness, if I'm honest, I probably wasn't really up for this session this morning when we started, but 3 hours later or 4 hours later, we needed that. And that's actually now going to help our performance. And that really realigned us and got us back on track to what is really important. And that's probably what I notice in leaders, that they see the value in the dynamics. And so for them to fight for it, they don't really need to even fight, just because they know it works. And so they're like, no, they might have some pushback from people who don't see the link to the value with investing in the dynamics, but they're like, no, they've experienced what high performance feels like and looks like, and they know that it's because of the dynamics being healthy and in good shape and how that drives the mechanics to get the results. And so there's just that clarity. So we love partnering with people who sort of get that. But at the same time, if you're listening, if you are not on board with wanting to get feedback or growing, or if you're a leader that doesn't want to sort of get input from your team, we won't work with you. Or if you're wanting like a 1 day warm and fuzzy feeling, team building day. I had a national company ask for that 3 weeks ago. I said, sorry, we don't do 1 days. Like this is a process, because otherwise, as Jake said, we need to be able to come back and test how you're going against your why and your how, and test the strength of your relationships and give you opportunities to have genuine conversations. So that's our model. If we were all in a room, this is probably where we'd say, all right, questions or comments or thoughts. But I reckon, Anna, we might have a few questions that have popped up. Any themes?
Yeah, we've got some good ones. There's a few at the moment about, I guess, the link between professional relationships and having genuine conversations. So to give you an example, Dion has asked, it would come across that you can only have a genuine conversation once you've got the relationship. What do you suggest for when the feedback might be time critical, but the relationship isn't quite where it needs to be? How could you go about that kind of conversation?
Yeah, so I guess the other part of it is in teams, we sometimes strategize. So, for instance, in our team at Leading Teams, so if I've got to have a conversation with Steve about performance or his behaviour, I might strategize with you, Anna. So I might go, okay, what do you think if I had this conversation with Steve? How do you think he's going to go? And what's the message I need him to hear? And sometimes that might, another person's perspective can help you to be clear about the message that the other person needs to hear. And I guess to also check your motive for having the conversation. But really, if you've done an audit of how strong your relationship is, and you have some trepidations around that giving and receiving of feedback, it comes back to you investing in the relationship for when you need it. And if you go and have a conversation with someone and the relationship isn't as strong as it needs to be, the message can be crystal clear, but it won't sink in.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's really it's sort of a catch-22. So, we talk about investing in the dynamics, but if you're sort of sitting there thinking, right, well, I want to give someone some feedback, and you go jumping straight into that conversation without having that strength in professional relationship, it can be a risk. And so having said that, sometimes things, and I think someone just said before about being, some things, sometimes the urgent will outweigh the important.
Yeah.
And one of our teammates, Daniel Healy, wrote a terrific article, Time versus Priority. And so, investing time, which is what we've really got, and what are your priorities? So if performance is a priority and getting the best out of your people or your team is a priority, you need to invest in it. That's how I'd answer that.
Yeah. And do you have any tips for someone who wants to build relationships, say they're new to a team?
Yep.
Is there, certain things that they could do to help build those relationships?
Yeah, definitely. So the first one we use with a lot of teams is and I'm not sure if you've got it there, Lace, or not, but the relationship pyramid. So when you're starting to think about the strength in your professional relationships, all relationships go through at different phases. And so starting to just understand where my relationship is with this person. Now, it may be different in the other person's eyes, but that could be literally the start of a conversation around how strong is our professional relationship in order to, give and receive feedback. So, and I've had plenty of...
Do you want to get it up for you, Joe?
Yeah, that'd be good, mate. Thank you. Like I was literally going to... had an example with a client one day where we got everyone to start to put down names of where they see their teammates, and there was a managing director and a general manager. One of the general managers literally had the MD at the next one down, Lace. So I'll go through them in a minute, but the stuff and things. We can talk about P&Ls, and we can talk about some of the things in mechanics, and we can talk about the weather and the footy team and all those sort of things. But then the general manager had the MD down the bottom at genuine conversation. So what they started to, I guess, just from that conversation was acknowledge that at the moment it was very much a one-way relationship. So a relationship needs to be sort of 100 and 100, and the investment in the relationship. So, but if you go back up to grunt and nod, it's nearly when you join a team or an organisation, g'day, how you going? And you might be lucky, depending on the culture, to get a smile. So sometimes I'll put smile in there, but some cultures you mightn't. And that's almost the start of a relationship, and that's why it's the wide part of the pyramid, because there's so many people in our professional life that we don't ever really get past that grunt or nod phase. And I guess, Lace, when Steve and I first joined, I still remember, getting introduced to the team, and I was really nervous. I had a lot of butterflies in my stomach, and I sort of went through a bit of my professional background. I don't remember you. I don't know if you remember asking this, Lace, but in front of everyone, you said, "Oh, have you got a family, or have you got kids, or are you married?" And I just remember thinking, "My goodness, that means everything to me." But I was so nervous that I forgot to even talk about Kylie or Luca and Gracie. So I think that also showed me, and Steve was obviously, one of the leaders in the organisation as well. That really helped me to start to look at what at leading teams, what's valued in the culture. If we go back to the model though, so if you're thinking about stuff and things, the next one down is being able to sort of have a conversation, which I said before, connecting through somebody else. So it happens in business a lot, and I guess it happens a lot in the work that we do, where we'll work with a team or an organisation, and they'll know someone else, and so sometimes your relationship is based on a relationship you have with somebody else, or somebody that's a third person that you can connect through. If you've got a relationship in those top three sort of parts of the model, in a professional relationship, it's we sort of call those quite safe. Means that it's not artificial harmony, but it means you haven't sort of got to that point where you've started to put a bit of rigor into investment into the relationship. So I guess if I stopped here, Lace, so if you were trying to be high performing and you got people to start to look at people in their team, and that a lot of people were up the top there, what sort of tools or techniques would you start to use after that?
Yeah, and I'm probably just thinking about Hannah. So was the person who asked the question, was it Dion, did you say?
Yep.
Dion, yeah, okay. So and so the question was around, so time critical, need to have a genuine conversation, but we may not have actually had the relationship yet.
And then there was another one about, if you're new to an organisation, how do you build relationships? With.
So yeah, okay. So I reckon there's two slightly different. They're connected to relationships. So the first one I'd say for Dion, one is sometimes this happens, but it's almost how you respond after some of these conversations. You're like, look, that wasn't ideal because I had to have a genuine conversation and we don't really have a relationship. But then I'd say it's what you do straight after that. So I feel like even though you might have to have a feedback conversation, and it's, if you had your time over again, you might go, gee, in our induction process or over the last 12 months or 2 years, I really wish I had spent more time getting to know them, or at least knowing one or two things about them, a bit to your point, Jake. I know their name and I know that they love two particular Netflix shows and they play chess on the weekends. Great. But if the person, even though you might only have some fleeting interactions, know that you care, and you have to then give some feedback and it's urgent, time critical, generally that helps. So I'd say that it's probably what's happening before. So for Dion now, it's probably thinking, are there some people in your world, and there might be others listening going, I reckon the strength of my relationship is like, some people are in my office or in the team and they've started through the pandemic. I don't even know who they are. I don't even know what they look like or what their names are. I'd say, well, that's pretty basic stuff. Like, be intentional over the next month to go out and know who they are and know one or two things about them. When I think about people, generally speaking, if you think of a line and a continuum, of at one end you've got relationship, the other you've got task. And all of us sit on that line around probably where our preference lies around how we engage with each other. So some, you hear their conversations and it's all about work and task and getting stuff done. If they deal more in numbers and facts and dot points, they're probably like, I'm not here to talk about what happened on the weekend. Let's just get into the work. Then I would probably mirror that to them, because it would be frustrating if I was like, oh, how's your family? If they're like, well, what are we doing this week? What's the on the flip side, if someone sits more on the relationship side and I'm like, let's just get in transactional, a bit more mechanical stuff, I'm like, that's not going to necessarily bring the best out of them. So I need to think about some questions that might connect a bit like you, Jake. Hey, mate, do you have a family? Like, what does life look like when you're not at work? Now, if the first time I met Jake, if he gave me nothing, I'm like, okay, he's probably more tasked then. But I saw him come to life when he answered that. I'm like, I reckon Jake might be more down the relationship. So I reckon that's what I probably need to be mindful of when I engage with Jake. So I'd say for someone who, it's the second question, Anna, someone who's coming in going, how do I build relationships and I'm new? If you observe sort of what people are talking about, how they're interacting, almost try and, just be pitching or tailoring your questions or your comments. If you think, I reckon they're a bit more relational, I might ask them a bit more about themselves, or I reckon they're a bit more tasked, I might ask them about what's their job. There's a sort of happened when the GFC happened, this idea of pre-scripting or pre-rehearsing, which I'd encourage anyone to think about. So the sort of story goes that with a lot of actors and actresses, they often have to rehearse and practice their lines before it comes time to get on stage. In leadership, and even when it comes to relationships, sometimes that's what people need to be thinking about, not just on autopilot. So if you're new to a team into an organization and you're like, okay, I know today I've got 3 meetings. So you might need to pre-script or pre-rehearse, might write a note of who's going to be in the meeting and what's a question I could ask them. Or if we sit in a room, who's someone I could sit next to that I know is always up for a chat. But you're almost thinking about, like, how can I position myself to have some interactions? If you notice that there are the same people who are going to get coffees or whatever it might be, you might say, hey, look, can I join you? So there might be a bit of courage that's required, but there's some just, some practice. Sometimes it helps just to share a bit of yourself. But again, I've heard some people might overshare, but just read the play a little bit there. It's a really good couple of questions. I hope we've given you some things to consider there.
There's another good one. This isn't the full question, but from Shane, that says, don't you have to start with genuine conversations to build relationships? And I'd be interested to hear what you guys think of that.
Oh, I think it's a great point, Shane. So it's if we sort of get to the point, I think, Lace, you sort of ended up some of those examples or questions you're starting to think about. So I guess the relationship pyramid, if we sort of tie this up, is it's a way to be able to strategize how to build strength in your professional relationships. But I guess the idea is not to make any assumptions other than that we can improve. And that means either team functionality or the relationship can improve. So I guess, if you're starting to think about, do I feel safe enough in this environment to be who I am or to share a bit of myself, but then also in order to have a genuine conversation, what are the key pillars? What do we need? And so I guess this in isolation is really problematic without an agreed behavioural framework. So without having behaviours that help to unify or align the team, if you use this model without that, it can be a hit and miss. I think you mentioned that, Lace, before a little bit as well. So being strategic is one part of it, but there's got to be an alignment piece. And that probably comes back to purpose. It comes back to the agreed behavioural framework that we spoke about before. But it's a really good point. So, a genuine conversation in our world is, the ability to give and receive feedback or to have a conversation between two people. So in order to build strength in your relationship, we sort of see this model as a really visual way to look at how you can get to that bottom. So you get to the bottom of the pyramid, but you can fast track it. And there are tools and techniques and activities that we do with teams that, we do pretty regularly. Like, I had one the other day with a newer client. I just got them to bring 3 items of significance, and there was a particular gentleman in the team who was, short back and sides and had been in the corporate world for a long period of time, and he brought in a really old plastic bag full of dreadlocks. And everyone just sort of went, how did that happen? So, and he sort of talked a bit about the journey of, surfing, playing music, all those sort of things into his career, and then sort of shifting his behaviour through feedback and through relationships, and getting to a point when he was on a boat in Croatia and he couldn't swim because his dreadlocks were too long, so he had to cut them off. And he kept them because that symbolises development, relationships, that sort of stuff. So I guess, there's lots of different activities, but it's a great point, Shane, that you make, that, to be able to feel safe enough to be able to have a genuine conversations around how you're feeling in a team, you need to have agreed behaviours.
Yeah, if I could add to that, if we just took the phrase like a genuine conversation, and I think it's almost the interpretation of the phrase genuine conversation. If you're hearing that as like, does that just mean like you're being genuine or being honest or being authentic in having conversations? Absolutely. That's where you should start as you meet people, and probably move down the pyramid. Like if you're talking about the weather or the footy, you want to be honest and open but probably the point that we want to really reinforce is that pointy end of the pyramid is where you've got the safety, the comfort, where you are able to give someone feedback about how their behaviour is making you feel. Now, sometimes, as you start building a relationship, you probably can't straight away have those conversations. That's why this model, which essentially looks at the level of communication you're able to have with a teammate in a professional context, generally people can work their way down. Sometimes people ask us, does this mean if you have to work with someone for a period of time and then that's 5 years in, you dip the pointy in? Absolutely not. Sometimes 5 years in, you're still very much at the top. Sometimes people move to the bottom and then something happens and they move back up. We wouldn't necessarily attest time to this. I've seen some people in teams within a very short amount of time create that psychological safety, create that comfort, that connection, and they're able to give and receive feedback very quickly.
When you hear the word comfort, Lace, does that link to high performance? Is it about comfort for you?
Well, I'd say the teams that I've worked with and leaders, they're comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So it's not comfort as in, this is easy. High performance, there's an edge to it, and so there's an element of like, gee, for example, in our business, last week we were together on Thursday, Friday. Our team got together. I knew, and I said this to someone last week on Tuesday, I said, look, I know that on Thursday and Friday, we are going to be uncomfortable. I'm feeling uncomfortable already knowing some of the conversations we're going to have, because there's some things which we as a business, when we're all together, we need to talk about, which I know there's going to be a range of different views on it. But I said that's to have integrity with us having a crack at living our model. That's what's required. And so in our sessions, I'd say if people are just coming in, this is just to tick a box and to be comfortable, then we're not hitting the mark in our role as facilitators. And it's probably not going to add the value that it could. That's
a really good point. I also think as well, just to add to it as well, so Shane, it's a great question. It's got me thinking a lot. That notion of a genuine conversation. So in a culture where we become more like a feedback culture as opposed to a review culture. So the first part of it is key centers of influence, modeling how to receive feedback. So if I know that there are people in the team who have had genuine conversations around behavioural performance and it's happened, and I've seen it happen, and I know how the recipients respond, then I'm going to be more inclined to be able to saddle up and have that conversation. So, but having said that, I also know that leaders, they'll see something and say something and do something. So if you're sitting here thinking, well, I'm not sure if it exists or not, that's what leaders do. They'll acknowledge, maybe a blind spot in the team and go, well, I'm going to have to show some courage or some vulnerability and have what we would call a genuine conversation around behavioural performance. And I think, yeah, to your point, Lace, you know, it is comfortable being uncomfortable, but everyone's responsibility in the team is to create that level of safety required in order to have those conversations so that they hit the mark and so the recipients can respond accordingly.
Nice.
Thanks, Jake. Another question, Anna?
Yeah, there's another one that kind of links to what we've just been talking about. So Glenn asked, you know, in Australia, we're a diverse country and feedback in different cultures can kind of mean different things, you know, so is there any tips that you guys have on managing that or making sure that,
Great question. I'd say asking people around, you know, what's their, like, I think just the whole word feedback, it evokes such a range of different feelings for different people in my, for me, but also in my work with teams over the years. And not to make an assumption of what someone's experience with feedback may have been like. And I think part of it, a good starting point could be even some storytelling, which could be a risk associated with that because some people's experience might be really bad. But sometimes understanding people's experiences to the point where you're in a room or having a conversation with them will influence how you best go about feedback, and then sort of probably maybe your own bias that you might have or your lens at which you've lived your world. And so I'd say for Glenn and for his team and for perhaps others, it's have a conversation. What's been your experience with feedback? And again, not a leading question or who's had a bad experience with feedback. Don't ask that. Like just a general open question. What's been your experience with feedback? Do you mind sharing some experience of what shaped your lens? Because in some ways, I feel our responsibility and our role, Jake, is wherever people are coming at with their experience of feedback is to shift it into going, feedback is great. Feedback, if it's done in the right spirit and the right intent, it makes everyone better. But because of the diversity we have in our country, which is brilliant, I think those conversations are very important to help understand that. So, yeah, and then a discussion around, well, given the diversity of our team, how could we do feedback well? What would a great feedback culture look like for us?
No doubt. I just think there was someone wrote before, and it popped up around our experience in Indigenous communities or cultures. And I remember running a review one day with a team, and I just said, "Can you give this team some feedback? But I want you to draw their feedback. So draw what it looks like, draw what they're doing that's helping, and draw what they're doing that's not helping." And there's a couple of Indigenous participants, and they literally, because it was their definitely you could tell it was their strength, they just grabbed the pastels and they started drawing, and then we were into a conversation, but it gave them an opportunity to be able to use a different communication means. So for me, you can't not communicate. So the other part of it, when we're talking about, how do I have a conversation or, different cultural diversity or differences, is you can't not communicate, but having an inquiry around why someone thinks the way they do, why they behave the way they do. And if you start at that point, that can start to open up the relationship building piece, but it can also start to understand that notion of seeking to understand before being understood, which is really pivotal in a high performance culture.
Awesome. Got a few people in the chat calling it feed forward, not feedback, which I like.
It's been raised a fair bit. Someone's going to have to write a book about that, I think.
One of you guys. There's some other questions too about purpose that I wanted to come back to that were kind of asked at the start. How do you discover what a team's purpose is, and could could you have a purpose for a team that's different to the organization's purpose?
I'll kick off, Jake, and then please jump in. So second part of that question, absolutely yes, but they should complement each other. So organizational purpose, and then you are sort of crystallizing your why. So how, like, if we're in a room together, how would we help a team establish their purpose? So I think Jake, asked a great question earlier, or phrased it around, like, if you didn't exist, what would be missing? I'd say in my experience helping teams clarify their purpose, sometimes people can drift into the output first. So we often think about your purpose is the input to get the output. So what do I mean by that? Sometimes people go, well, isn't our purpose just about making as much money for the business as possible? No, that's the output. So what's your why to get the result? Often we get teams to think about it in your language. There should be a simplicity to your purpose. It should not be a long, drawn-out statement of why. Again, sometimes we work with teams, again, depending on your experiences, and I've done a fair bit of reading on the semantics here. So purpose and mission, some would replace it. So I don't, if people are like, but I'm confused because you're saying common purpose, but we've got a mission that's about our why. Sometimes they're interchangeable. So I just want to clarify that. Again, sometimes I see teams trying to put the how into their purpose. So they're starting to put in a lot of behaviours, which makes it clunky and too long. It's like, no, why do you exist? So in leading teams, our purpose is to improve the performance of individuals and teams. So I ask myself, how am I going with that today? By the time I get to dinner tonight, how have I gone with that today? Now, we've got a behaviour framework. So our how is that we find ways to collaborate. What we're doing right now is a cracking example. I love doing this with Anna and Jake. And I feel, as I go and, put the girls to bed tonight, I'm like, how did I go today at living our purpose? I'm like, yeah, I reckon the morning was great. Like we lived our model. We brought it to life with potentially some new people who aren't familiar with leading teams or some old friends. And I got to work with a couple of teammates. So hopefully that helps just establish, it should be a conversation that happens amongst the whole team, not just you. It should take a few goes. I wouldn't expect you to sort of nail it in 5 minutes. So there might be some refining that's done. If people drift into the weeds, it should elevate you in terms of, like, and sometimes if you're throwing around lines, ask why. So why? And then just keep asking why, and then that might lift you to a higher level around the purpose of your team. Jake, anything to add on that?
I was just going to say, can you actually remember the purpose of the band? So you gave us the 3 different responses before. Can you remember what they settled on?
I know they're creatives. They were talking about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures at one point, and then that got them really aligned around excellence. I'll have to come back to you.
I just think if it's not there,
it wasn't one of those 3 that they all threw up.
Yep.
Because they realised that the purpose of them having to make a whole lot of money wasn't the input to get the output.
Correct.
Rock and roll, that's what they did. But it wasn't their why. Connecting with the hearts and minds of their fans, that was probably closer to where they got to.
There's an article you wrote, isn't there?
There is, yeah.
Yep. We'll share that with everyone. That's good. Another one too, going back to talking about, I guess, when you're bringing in new people and hiring on culture. So, can you just go into that a bit further and what hiring on culture actually means. I think there's a few questions about, you know, does it mean if we've got people from different cultures, literally, can they all work together in a team? You know, how does that work?
Yep.
Yeah.
I'll jump in, Lace, and then we might end up talking a little bit about the cylinder model. But I think when you mentioned before, Steve, which got me thinking, I wrote it down, was cultural fit. And the amount of times that I've used that in a session sort of subconsciously, and then had questions around, what do you mean by that? So I guess there's a couple of different distinctions when I start to think about, you know, a cultural fit, or how do you create what a character looks like in a team. So one of the questions I guess we've got in one of our KRAs is around evidence of buy-in. So when we start to think about, you know, someone's buy-in to the team, their ability to display behaviour on a consistent basis. So I know, Steve, you mentioned, you know, find ways to collaborate is one of ours. And we could use our distance at leading teams as an excuse for not doing it. But I know, you know, we reward each other on our ability to live those behaviours on a very regular basis. And, you know, there's a number of our teammates that will find ways to collaborate and sometimes put the team's needs ahead of their own. And I know that's, you know, the leadership team purpose. But, you know, that's probably the other part of it to start to think about is, so I guess having that proactive response under pressure, and everyone in the team starts to understand what it is our culture, what's our non-negotiable, how can I behave my way into this team? And I guess when you're starting to recruit people according to that, it's there's people out there, I've sat through plenty of them, I'm sure you have, Lace, as well, that they're professional interviewees. They sit there and they sound great. What we want to try and do is bridge the gap between what people say and what they do, so their behaviour.
Yep.
So that's the bit for me, starting to think about, you know, that clarity around behaviour.
It's you mentioned the word recruitment, so probably, and I'd say for the person who asked, like, you know, we're going through and have been through a number of people brought into our business. If I think about our most recent example, we've just brought on a really exciting recruit here in South Australia. And so the process was, you know, so from an expression of interest, job ad goes out. It wasn't just sent through your CV. There was a criteria and 5 questions that all aligned to our agreed behaviours. And we asked, as an expression of interest, we would like you to provide evidence and around where you've lived this. Now, we got over 100 people applying for the job. I reckon I probably put a line through about 80 because they didn't address, they just put a CV in and they didn't address the criteria. So sorry if you're listening and you didn't get the job, if you didn't address the criteria, like for us straight away, we were like, they haven't put the time into actually answering up front, sort of. And so we thought that the people who went to the energy, put the energy and time into answering the criteria, which for some people was a page or 2 of reflecting on their life story professionally, personally, and addressing our criteria, we were like, that's a cultural fit for us. The fact they've even done that, then we move through the next 3 phases. I'd say that's what we do. I would encourage anyone to ask their family, their friends, their networks, to go, well, what does your recruitment process look like? What are you doing that sort of connects to your culture? I just think there's huge, you don't have to look too far and go, are we just shortchanging ourselves? Are we just doing 1 or 2 steps and bring someone in because we need to fill a seat? Or do we have a bit of rigor and a real plan and follow a plan around how we find the right people? So once they're on board, that's it, you know, you're not even halfway there. Then it's really thinking about how do we induct them in their first week, in their first month, so they're really clear on who we are and how we want to behave. And that, put yourself in their shoes. What do you want them to be saying? What do you want them to be feeling? What do you want them to be doing after 1 week? And if in your first week it's largely in the mechanics, I'd ask you to review that if you're serious about culture. But if you reward the mechanics, if you if that's who you want, and that's how you spend your first week, then you're doing a good job. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it's great. And I think it links to, there was a few questions about, I guess in how things are currently, there's a lot of times where, there isn't 100 job applications. There's a very small pool. So then for me, that's where the induction bit becomes really critical if you don't have the choice at the start, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's another question here about back to genuine conversations. And they say that, it can get really hard when there's disagreement or when there's emotion involved. How would you navigate those?
Are they talking from, it's hard, this is where we'd love the conversation. It's almost like, are you getting emotional, or is the person you're chatting with, like what? Because I feel like that might influence how we answer it.
Yep.
But if it's a generalization, if you're having a genuine conversation and there's emotion and heat, is that how we should take it, Anna?
Yep. That's what it sounds like to me.
All right. Jake?
I think come back to sometimes it's the right place, right time and right message. So, and if you've initiated a conversation, you're responsible for delivering the message you want the other person to hear. And if at any stage you're feeling like that will be compromised, you've then got to make a choice around, is this the right time? Is this the right place? Am I delivering the right message? And sometimes it's okay to say, I think we need to stop and just have a 5-minute break. Sometimes it might mean, okay, we're going to come back to this. Giving each other, having that conversation, but then asking that really clear question straight after the message has been delivered is, what did you hear, or what have you heard? And getting someone to be able to, amongst all the emotion, have they heard the key part of it? So I guess over the journey I've heard, people will say, don't get caught up in the excuse the French, the SHIT sandwich. So this is the stuff in the middle I actually really want heard, but this is the other stuff that's a bit fluffy on the outside. So you've got to be very careful not to get stuck in that one, but it's being clear about what's the message I want the other person to hear. And if they're not hearing it, then I've got to go back to, how did I deliver it? What's my tone like? What's my relationship like? What questions did I ask? What questions didn't I ask? And then I guess that the other part of it is communication is not what you say, it's the response you get. So if you're not getting the response after it could be a week, you can't expect someone to respond straight away in the moment when you've just given them feedback, because that's where things can become quite emotional and heated. So the skill, what we're doing, and we do it all the time with teams, is the skill is to receive feedback, but take it away and let it marinate, let it sit and review it rigorously, and then respond accordingly. And that came from the book by Graham Winter, The Man Who Cured the Performance Review.
Great question. There's probably a lot of depends on this, so I'll give you 3 things that I think help. One, this may not be applicable, but I reckon the preparation before some of these conversations is really important. So sometimes we don't have time to prepare, but it is all the things that Jake is talking about. Part of the preparation, I'd say, are there people outside of your bubble that you can talk to sort of almost just test or practice or throw around, here's a conversation I need to have. I reckon this is the best case. This is the worst case. This is the likely scenario of where it might go. But sometimes you don't have time to prepare. But again, if you do, I reckon that's a really good sort of way of tackling or addressing some of these chats. I feel for myself, again, seeing it in teams, when you have the humility in yourself to be able to fall on your own sword in these conversations. So if you're just like, I'm going in to get my own way, but if you're like, hold on, as you said, Jake, communication is the response I get. Perhaps I wasn't clear, or perhaps that I've missed something, or perhaps there's something else going on in your world, that your emotion, your response is being triggered by, it may not be work related, it could be stuff outside of work. So I think, you know, if it's you, just being mindful of, do I need to fall on my own sword in some of these conversations?
That's great. We're getting close to 11:30, so there's a few more questions, but you guys have answered the majority of them. So I'm pretty happy to leave it there for now, unless you guys have anything you want to finish on.
No, I just really enjoyed the conversation, and obviously thanks, Anna, again for going through all the questions, and hopefully we've added some value to everyone. And I really appreciate that there's a number of people who've jumped on from all across the country. So thanks very much for the conversation.